Also get them online at climateindsecurity.org/briefing book. So this, I'll just read the top line from this. The Climate and Security Advisory Group is a nonpartisan group of military, national security, homeland security, foreign policy experts, recommends that a new administration comprehensively address the security risk of climate change at all levels of national security planning, elevate and integrate attention to these risks across the U.S. government, as well as strengthen and create new institutions for addressing them. Very exciting. This panel will be moderated by Captain James Goudreau. Captain Goudreau is the former acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Navy Energy, where he was responsible for all matters pertaining to the Navy's operational and shore energy capability development, resiliency, energy efficiency, energy acquisition reform, and culture change. His sea duty and overseas assignments include Assistant Chief of Staff for Logistics at Expeditionary Strike Group 7 and Amphibious Force 7th Fleet, Assistant Supply Officer on board USS Nimitz and USS Reasoner, Supply Officer of USS The Sullivans, and Supply Officer, Joint Maritime Facility, St. Maugwin. Captain Goudreau also served as the Director of the Navy Energy Coordination Office while working at the Chief of Naval Operations Staff. And Captain Goudreau has been awarded the Legion of Merit, the Meritus Service Medal, Navy Commendation Medal, and Navy Achievement Medal in various campaigns and unit awards. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And first off, I would like to say thank you very much to Caitlin and Frank and their staff for the work that they've done to not only focus the discussion and to be able to start building a community of practice and a community of knowledge, but actually putting the work and the effort in to assemble all of the panels today and make today happen. So thank you very much. That's an important step in moving this forward, and I appreciate that. Thanks also to our panel, who collectively, if you take a look at the experience that the folks sitting to my left have, you're looking at over 100 years of combined experience with government service and focusing on these issues and many other complex, dynamic
It's only
issues.
a testament to our age.
I'm pleased to talk about each of the panelists for a few minutes. The Honorable Sherry Goodman obviously had an introduction earlier today, so you're aware of her work as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and her work with the Senate Armed Services Committee. But also, I want to highlight that she is absolutely an expert in this field. She served on the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel. She not only got degrees from Harvard, but has been an adjunct research fellow and an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and speaks with a great amount of wisdom and experience on these issues. Admiral Dave Titley retired from the Navy as the oceanographer and navigator of the Navy. When you take a look at issues associated with climate change, he was the expert within the Navy. And unfortunately, a lot of folks will say, hey, I'm not a scientist, but he can actually tell you he's a scientist, which is great to have him on board. Since he retired, he was the founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk at Penn State, has served as basically the chief operating officer for NOAA, and continues to serve in various capacities in different volunteer groups. General Bob Barnes, is also a member of the advisory board. All four of these folks serve on the advisory board for this. He retired from the Army as the Assistant Judge Advocate General for Civil Law and Litigations, had been the Deputy Legal and Legislative Counsel to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and was involved in lots of different issues in understanding what the impact of our actions in a larger global climate and scenario and world are. Also affiliated with the Kennedy School with some of the work that he's done in the past. And Dr. Marcus King is the John O. Rankin Associate Professor and Director of the Master of Arts in International Affairs program at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Certainly very active in this area, and lots of different published works and dialogue related to climate and the impact on regional security and instability. So we look forward to the discussion today. This is not a political discussion. As many of the members of previous panels have said, this is an issue that has relevance today for reasons other than party affiliation. Part of the reality is, though, what we have talked about previously, although this is not a political issue, needs to be implemented in a political environment. And when you start to talk about the complexity of the problem and the challenges in working across the whole of government, you really need to start to talk about the details. And you need to start to talk about the funding. And you need to start to talk about the resources and the coordination and the collaboration. And those are not easy things. One of the issues that we've tackled with Caitlin and Frank's team is how do you give advice, how do you move that forward? And so certainly, as we release the briefing book for a new administration, one of the intentions is to start to get into the details. We talked this morning about what's happening, why it's important, and the talk this afternoon starts to move into the how do you actually do it? How do you actually make that change happen? How do you move the dial? And it is not an easy process. It is not a simple process, and it needs a significant amount of coordination and effort. The military overall views this as a long-term issue. And the military has been charged with risk management. You heard a number of the panelists talk about that earlier this morning. We have to assess risk and we have to manage risk. And if you take a look at the conditions that we operate in and where we operate from, those conditions are changing. We talked about sea level rise. We talked about the changing Arctic. We talked about issues with flood and famine and drought and how that impacts where, when, and how often we operate. Just to highlight one of those things, as we talked about the change of the ice cover in the Arctic earlier this morning, it absolutely was much more rapid than anticipated. And to put a point to that, this Friday, the 16th of September, the Crystal Serenity will dock in New York, having made the Northwest Passage, departing from Seward, Alaska on 16 August. So it is a very different operating environment. The challenges to support the safety and security of our citizens and of global citizens in large, that challenge just became greater. And it's going to continue to expand and continue to become greater. This discussion becomes one about action versus inaction and what the costs and what the risks are. Citigroup released a report last year that said action that would be required to address climate change issues would be $190.2 trillion. The cost for no action to just maintain the status quo would be $192 trillion. Now, 1.8 doesn't sound like a very large number, but when you put trillion after that, you're talking actually some real money. It's not just a rounding error. And additionally, the possible cost globally to not acting to address this could be the loss of over $44 trillion in gross domestic product across the world. So if you talk about those costs and the losses and the associated risks, this isn't a small issue. For the military, obviously, we don't deal in GDP, but we do deal in cost, and our cost is sometimes in readiness. We need to have training. We're impacted by flooding. We're impacted by wildfires. We're impacted by the loss of land potentially in Key West, Parris Island, Lejeune. Critical areas for us to actually generate and sustain and project readiness. If you take a look at the cost of the Pacific infrastructure and what it would take to replace or move as sea level rise impacts that, it's astounding. General Keyes and Admiral Parker spoke earlier today. What standard do we rebuild infrastructure to? Even just normal recapitalization phase. What standard do we build to, and when do we decide not to rebuild in that spot? When do we decide when to move? Those are incredibly complex discussions. The devil's in the details. It really does require a whole of government approach. And part of the reality is there are political aspects to those discussions. There are economic aspects. There are societal aspects. And this is meant to be a discussion this afternoon to move that dialogue further and to move into action. What I'd like to do is to ask the panelists to answer an initial question, and each will take a few minutes to answer this. Based on your professional and personal experience on these issues, how specifically do you think the briefings in this, the recommendations of this briefing book help address the national security risks associated with climate change? And we'll start with Ms. Goodman.
Thank you, Jim, for that very thoughtful introduction. And we'll try to keep you awake here now after that nice lunch. Look, at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, it's all about leadership. And that's how you make things happen. We're sitting here, across from the Senate office buildings, the Capitol, next to the U.S. Supreme Court. Leaders make things happen. What the essence of this briefing book is to say, the next president of the United States needs to make this a priority and thread it throughout the major national security apparatus of the United States government. I had the privilege of joining the executive branch in the Department of Defense in 1993 with an incoming president at a time when environmental priorities were of great importance to the incoming administration. And that's why the position that I held in DOD for 8 years was created, was to elevate the importance of environmental issues at that time. Environmental issues were about cleaning up contaminants, compliance with environmental laws, some about climate change, but the importance and engaging foreign militaries around the world on these sets of issues in the early post-Cold War period to advance our strategic priorities of building trust, advancing democracy with partner nations around the world. And that made a considerable difference. And now in this era, there's an equal, comparable opportunity to elevate the attention throughout the federal government in key agencies given to the complex challenges of climate and security that we've been addressing this morning.
Okay, thanks. So since it is after lunch, I'm going to call my own audible here. I'm going to make this audience participation time because I can just see that you need some audience participation at about this point, and we don't want to wait until like the 5 minutes left in this. But this is going to be easy. Please believe me on that. And all I require is a show of hands. So we've heard this morning distinguished 4 stars. We've heard lots of people, the comptroller of the Pentagon, all talk about this climate issue. So show of hands. Who believes in climate change? Okay, I don't. I know, this is a cheap rhetorical trick. And the reason I don't, and actually General Keyes kind of talked about this morning a little bit, this is physics, not religion, okay? So the apolitical part is the climate is changing. I mean, that we know that to about the same degree that we know that if you drop off a 7-story building, it's going to hurt because of gravity. We know that. The policy response is a political decision. I mean, that's what politics do, right? It's the way, it's a messy process, but it's the way we, integrate values and judgments and what we believe is important, and we come up with some sort of solution, or even if we don't come up with a solution, that in turn is an action. So the policy response, that is political, as it should be. But the climate change, the way I talk about it is I'm convinced by the evidence, and there's overwhelming weight of evidence that the climate is changing there. We talked a little bit about the sea level rise, and it's a really good report, but if I'm not mistaken, the time frame is what, till 2100, right? Yeah, it's mostly till most of these reports go till 2100. Unfortunately, the ice does not get the memo that it's supposed to stop melting in 2100. So we're actually locking in already today multi-meter sea level rise. So when people argue about is it going to be a foot or a foot and a half, it's like those will be rounding errors. Those will be rounding errors. Okay, now I'll do what I was actually asked to do. But this is way more fun, and we got some audience participation. So the next time your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving asks you, why do you believe in climate change? Tell him you don't, but tell him you are convinced by the evidence there. See what he does. I would, really, I could not agree more with Sherry's comment about leadership. I mean, Admiral Locklear said some very nice things this morning, but the only reason I got involved with climate in the military is because of a gentleman named Admiral Gary Roughead, who was at the time back in late 2008, 2009, he was our chief of naval operations, the senior admiral in the serving in the U.S. Navy. He was the one who, as the Arctic ice was frankly collapsing in '07, he was getting a lot of conflicting advice from a lot of different people, and basically, rather than a belief system of yes, it's happening, no, it's not happening, what he did is he turned to his two-star action officer, that would be me, and said, okay, Titley, go figure this out. What's going on and what do we need to do? And I'm interested, and we already heard what happens when the boss is interested, right? So we know where that went. So the reason the Navy has been perceived to have been a leader on this issue is because the Chief of Naval Operations was interested. That's why. So these recommendations, when you get a chance to read through them, because I'm sure the copies are just flying off the table back there, you will see that in many places we are asking for, at senior levels, like in the Office of the President, on the National Security Council, on the immediate staff of the Secretary of Defense, to have a person who really is the person accountable or responsible. Admiral Rickover very famously said, if nobody's in charge, then nobody's accountable. That doesn't mean that this is a niche issue. You know, as Admiral Locklear said, you know, you just do this on Sunday afternoon after you've done everything else. But without somebody making sure that these very, very challenging tasks are in fact woven through the fabric of the government, we're probably going to suboptimize. We might suboptimize anyways, but at least if we're thinking about it, we have a better chance of getting closer to right the first time. And we've already heard today, you know, it is kind of hard to get your mind around this, because you have all these things happening to other countries, pressures on food, energy, water, health, while at the same time, the infrastructure that we in the U.S. military use to generate readiness, that would be our bases and our training ranges, will also be put under duress by the changing climate. So it comes at us kind of from both ways. Both it's going to change the mission set, or certainly increase the number of missions we are asked to do, while at the same time making it more challenging for us to get our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines ready. We believe that the recommendations in this briefing book will help set the structure to ensure that our administration can be successful in the coming years ahead. Thanks.
General Barnes?
Yeah, I come at this issue from a couple of perspectives. I'm sure others do as well, but for me in particular, one perspective is this is about conflict avoidance. A lot of people don't understand that DoD is intensely interested in conflict avoidance, and much of what the department does and the national security community does is aimed at avoiding the need for conflict, avoiding the need for emergency humanitarian disaster response and other similar kinds of things. So really getting a handle on this issue and treating it like the strategically significant risk that it is to me to look at it first through a conflict avoidance lens. What can we do now so that we don't have to fight an unnecessary war 10 years from now? The other perspective I have is that this requires long-range strategic thinking. It requires some immediate action, some near-term action. But primarily what it requires is the imagination and the strategic insight to know what we need to do now and in the midterm so that we can avoid long-term problems. And that's not easy to do, but it is one thing that the Department of Defense is good at doing, is thinking now. When you design a ship, you don't design it to today's conditions. You design it to anticipated conditions, my friend tells me, at the point when you expect that ship to hit the water and through its life. we need to apply that same kind of thinking, strategic, long-term thinking across the board. The other perspective I have comes from my time as the so-called Goldwater-Nichols expert for Admiral Crowe and General Powell when they were chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Goldwater-Nichols was just coming in. And I saw how complicated it was, even within a single department, to break the long-term inertia of organizational and jurisdictional stovepipes and ways of thinking. We badly need that same kind of initiative and hard work at the interagency whole of government level, particularly on a complicated, subtle program like this requiring that kind of strategic long-term thinking and investment. You'll find in the briefing book a lot of the recommendations relate to the nuts and bolts of what needs to be in place at multiple agencies, not just Department of Defense, but state, USAID, DHS, intelligence, NSC, to actually allow the same kind of integrated thinking and effort that Goldwater-Nichols allowed the military to do, and that's been so important to the military's success over the last 20 years. So anyway, I come from those three perspectives. It's conflict avoidance, it's the requirement for long-term strategic thinking as well as immediate action. And it really need to get down into the details on how the machine works and how it needs to be changed so that it works in this issue. Thank you.
Dr. King?
Yes, I'd also like to address the issue from the perspective of long-term strategic thinking. My area of research particularly is on stability in fragile states and the effects of climate change impacts. So the 2014 QDR, the Climate Adaptation Roadmap, both recognize the potential for climate change to undermine stability in regions that are of national security concern to the U.S. And one of the places that these effects are felt most viscerally is really in water scarcity. You know, that's something that has already upon us. So no wars have been fought entirely over water. But our attitudes on that are changing. There was an Intelligence Committee assessment in 2012 that predicted that over the next 10 years, many countries important to the United States that water would contribute to the risk of failure, state failure in those countries, and also that they would be distracted from cooperation with the United States on key foreign policy objectives. At that point, downscaled climate models were indicating that freshwater availability would not keep up with demand. And so I just wanted to briefly sketch out a couple of these scenarios in places that are of national security concern to the U.S. For example, in Egypt, they're geographically disadvantaged by the fact that 93% of their water comes from outside their borders. There's the problem of sea level rise that's inundating the delta and the very narrow agricultural zone on each side of the Nile. And so Egypt's really the breadbasket in the area of the delta, where it's also going to experience a 1 meter sea level rise. So one of the many drivers of Arab Spring was unrest caused by a spike in these food prices. Russia experienced a drought which decreased the yield harvest that year and led to panic buying from countries such as China. So, you know, their governance measures have been a problem in these countries. And I also wanted to talk about Nigeria, another country of strategic interest to the U.S. that I've looked at closely. Nigeria is a strong contributor to peacekeeping missions with the United States that help us in our struggle against extremism. But there are actually 3 different internal conflicts right now in Nigeria that all have some connection to water stress. So in the north, there is a humanitarian emergency you might be familiar with, near Lake Chad, where 1.5 million people are displaced. That's reducing their resilience, their capacity to resist Boko Haram. Also from the north, there's a migration of Fulani tribesmen who are getting into land disputes with the existing agrarians in that area. So it's these sort of things. It's the cleavages that already exist in the society, and then along comes the stressor of water. And displaced populations have nowhere to go, both in the case of Nigeria and Egypt. So these are the kinds of things that really concern us. And the IPCC predicted that 50% of adaptation funding will go to water issues over the next 20 years. So how would the recommendations in this report specifically relate to these problems that I've identified? I would say it's really the recommendations from the intelligence area. And so there was an IE on the national security implications of global warming done back in 2008, and also the ICA I mentioned in 2012, but they're both outdated. They're both based on peer-reviewed science at that time. And so what we really would like to see would be the creation of new capabilities to predict and to ascertain, exactly where these hotspots are to emerge in the future. So I think that the recommendation for creation of a national intelligence officer, specifically for developing and integrating intelligence, would go a long way toward improving our readiness to deal with these sorts of emergent issues. So it's that, and it's just the continuation of the need to develop this sort of early warning capability that could be directed either from the NSC or more on the operational level from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For example, tasking the COCOMs to develop plans that relate to the emergence of this sort of instability within their areas of operation.
Obviously, Sherry talked a lot about the leadership issues associated with this, and when a number of the folks earlier today and some of the panelists right now talked about whole of government, it leads to an entirely different discussion. In DC, it's not about the money, it's all about the money. And when you talk about the administrative burden and the coordination and the efforts associated with standing up a new effort or really aligning existing efforts, some folks would routinely say, it's like, well, why would we create a new cabinet level position? Why would we take on that extra effort? What do we really gain? What's that return on investment from doing that as opposed to leveraging the existing national security apparatus and the work that's been done by different agencies thus far? And I'm curious on folks' thoughts on that. It's directed to the entire panel in no particular order.
Well, I think you need to marshal the evidence that shows that we are going to be spending more in coming years on simply responding to natural disasters and the consequences of climate change as they arise rather than getting ahead of the curve. And that's one of the reasons that we need the leadership focus on these set of issues. We've had a lot of progress in recent years in creating a global framework for dealing with reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and addressing the mitigation side. But what we are living in, as the film will say, the age of the consequences, right? We are already having to deal with populations that are being displaced and countries and regions running out of water. But we're only right now dealing with it when it becomes an immediate threat to human life that has a strategic import to the United States. But in coming years, and the argument I would make, inside the government now, let's say in defense, where people talk about the 5-year defense plan. Well, in your FIDUP, in your 5-year defense plan, we are going to have to invest, as Dov Zakheim said in an earlier panel, when we're going out to take on an HADR mission, a humanitarian assistance disaster relief mission, that's coming out of current funds. That's like taking, the paycheck you got for this month, you got to spend on something you weren't planning on because it's an urgent need, and instead of taking what you were planning to spend it on. So, we have to sort of try to shift that focus around, and the only way you could do that is to have plans in place and deal with the more strategic importance of these issues. So we have to address things like migration. We've got to develop plans for resilience. These are not just nice to haves in the future. These are actually going to be essential elements of our security planning. And that is going to take a whole of government approach. It's not just what DOD is doing. Intelligence is important, but it's not just the intel community. Diplomacy matters. Development is going to be a critical focus. Development critically focused, prioritized to these specific needs. And the research and development community and S&T is going to be vital as well. So they all have to come together with a strategic focus with attention from the top by our leaders.
So I'll just, I would agree with everything that Sherry said there. Here's maybe just another way of framing the same thing. So from a physics, from a science aspect, if you somehow were grand king for a day for the world, and you snapped your fingers and you said, there shall be no more greenhouse gas emissions, period, we're done, okay, just like that. The Earth would still change climate for about another 30 years because we're not in balance right now. It's like it's a big diesel truck and you got your accelerator mashed to the floor and the thing's still winding up. That's what's going on right now. If you want any more details, find me in the break because I don't think anybody else will really care. But the fact is we have, even if we stop greenhouse gases today, we have decades more changes. Now, we've already just started to see some of the beginnings of these changes. We saw how far the storm surge went in Sandy. We keep seeing these very extreme rainfall events, Louisiana, but it was also Ellicott, Maryland, and before that, we can go up and down the East Coast. So, and people saying, my God, I've never seen this before. Well, get used to that. So how are we going to stop treating each of these as a one-of and actually look at this is part of the new normal, and part of the new normal is it's not what I would call stationary. It keeps changing. So we are all, for everyone's life in here, the reality is we are all going to be living in a changing climate, which means the weather that we experience changes. If we don't get our arms around that through leadership, through having somebody accountable, through thinking of this really throughout our government, we are going to be constantly in respond and react mode, which usually is expensive and is almost always less effective.
One of my observations over my too many decades in Washington and dealing with strategy and politics and how they intersect is that political decisions and political action, and I don't mean just congressional, but executive branch as well, are a lagging indicator from strategic reality. That is to say, there is typically a lag time between when you need to take some action and that is sinks through the system so action is actually taken. So part of our effort is close that lag time so that the political need, the clear need for action and the political will to act, the time gap closes. And that's as much inside the executive branch as it is on the Hill. And of course, that's informed by the larger public view of all of this. So again, a lot of our recommendations, if you look at them, are not cost heavy. There was a lot of resistance, from my own experience, there was a heck of a lot of resistance inside the Department of Defense for Goldwater Nichols before it happened. All kinds of claims of extra cost and all of that. What it did was remove a lot of duplication and make things a lot more efficient and effective. The same will be true at the interagency level. A lot of these recommendations will end up making things more effective and efficient and cheaper. And the other final point I'd make is that thankfully our nation has spent much more on conflict avoidance than we have on fighting wars over the last half century. If you think about it, our whole deterrent force is aimed at avoiding conflict, and this is just another example of applying that kind of strategic thinking to a new situation.
So just briefly picking up on Sherry's comments about a whole of government approach and a little bit of what Bob said about amassing the political will, I think it's really important to start with the White House and the NSC because political leadership from the top is critical. But in terms of the interagency process, I believe that the State Department would lead that process. So starting with the State Department integrating concerns of climate change into more of a strategic narrative within the interagency process would be an important thing to consider. Also, maybe the idea of an America First strategy, and by that I mean working with Homeland Security and people that are responsible for resilience and disaster response to really see what the impacts of climate change are at home, both within areas that are subject to disasters and also the impact on training ranges and military communities. So we could first build a consensus around internationalization of the issue later, which is the area that I've spoken more about with the strategic consequences. But I think that it really begins at home and it really begins at the local level.
So, Dr. King, previously we had talked a little bit about climate migration, climate refugees. That got touched on a couple of times during the day today. If you were to take a look at the efforts it would take to assess the impact and coordinate the impact globally, for instance, there's one community in Louisiana that just got a $48 million set aside to move a relatively small population a relatively small distance because they've been impacted. What do you think the scope of that effort and collaboration is, and how would you prioritize, out of the listed recommendations, who are those key players, and how does that have long-term value?
Well, I would say, I mentioned instability in areas, including Syria, Middle East, North Africa, Nigeria, and a lot of times the real catalyst for instability when looking in these situations is migration. So migration's a global problem. Norman Myers, a scholar, once predicted there would be 200 million climate refugees by 2050. And so the reasons behind migration are very complicated. Climate change is only one factor among many that causes poverty and then people move. So I really think it's a global issue to begin with. And then the question is, how is that addressed? And I think another problem with addressing it is really a legal regime. Right now, environmental migrants are not considered refugees. And if they were to be considered refugees, which in fact might be more accurate, that opens up the liability essentially for nations to grant political asylum to these people. So it's sort of an overwhelming problem. I've thought about it a lot more in the context of the international dimensions of it. But frankly, in Mesoamerica, there are environmental forcers that are causing migration through El Salvador into Mexico, putting some pressure on the U.S. borders. So in that sense, it's also a homeland security issue.
One of the things that have been mentioned about in both the book and discussion today was incorporating climate and assessing the vulnerability and mitigation strategies as part of our long-term planning, as part of our training, our education, to start to build the knowledge across the community and the profession of warfare to understand the part this really plays. What are some of the practical examples on where the military or the State Department or other institutions across government should be inserting these issues into discussion and into planning and into programming? And this is a general question.
Does that mean it's the agenda?
Not necessarily.
Well, any other complex, interagency, multiple nation strategic challenge, right? You have to first try to figure out what's needed and then what the opportunities are. And I think we have some tremendous opportunities with some of our key partner allied nations around the world, some of whom are frankly ahead of us in their strategic thinking about this. India was discussed much today, Bangladesh. But the UK has been a leader in this analytical strategic thinking for some time. So we shouldn't try to solve this problem ourselves. In other words, we should become part of that international effort more strongly. And then at the interagency level, there are all kinds of points of intersection already built into the system that are opportune places to start building this a stronger relation. For example, at the combatant commands, they all have a senior State Department political advisor. Most of them have a senior USAID official to provide advice to the combatant commander on what USAID can bring to the strategic response table at the COCOM levels. There's a pretty thorough interagency collaboration between Department of State and Department of Defense on security assistance, foreign military sales. But that system hasn't started to deal with this problem. And so you can leverage what already exists. We're not talking about creating a whole bunch of brand new stuff, but we're repurposing. Some of the resourcing issues are there. For example, the offices in USAID and State Department that focus on conflict avoidance and really trying to get ahead of conflict are grossly under-resourced and are forced to have a 1 or 2 or 3 year timeline when they should be having a 10 or 15 or 20 year timeline. So there's some opportunities like that. But overall, this isn't a resource intensive, our set of recommendations is not resource intensive in terms of the money it would take. It'll take leadership, but it doesn't take a lot of money.
If you go through the briefing book here, you'll see that recommendation number 1 for the Department of Defense is nothing more than do what you've already said you're going to do. Now, we say it a little more bureaucratically than that. We actually say we should execute DoD Directive number 4715.21. And my guess is there are more than a few people in this room who probably had a hand at crafting that. For what it's worth, I think it's a really good document. It's a really good DoD directive signed out by Deputy Secretary Work. But it will be nothing more than yet another piece of paper unless there is somebody who is like fairly senior who asks periodically, it's like, so how's it going? How are we doing on this? Are we doing, because there's a lot of pretty specific things in there. We don't need to rewrite that, but those give a pretty good idea. If you go through that DoD directive, it's a pretty good idea of where the DoD can lead, where they can be supporting, and really what the roles and responsibilities are. It focuses very heavily on what we would call the adaptation. That is, the climate is changing, so how do we make sure that we keep our readiness and we basically can keep at least parallel or even half a step ahead, so we don't get into this reactive mode here. But, you know, I mean, and it's buried even in here. It's like on page, I don't know, you know, it's unfortunately it's on page 11. It is the first recommendation for the DoD, but it's probably, you know, if the DoD could do nothing but what they've already said they're going to do, and actually carry that out, that would be pretty significant there. Right. And it talks about the combatant commanders and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which then relates you into state and USAID and the other interested government agencies here.
So when we start to talk about adaptation versus mitigation and the type of activity, the prioritization of activity, you know, the briefing book lays out some of the discussion points on that. What are some of your thoughts on where should those efforts be? You know, so if one of the folks in the room was the one person that was appointed to a cabinet level position, where are some of those focus areas and the priorities to say adaptation versus mitigation, and what kind of practical activity does this really look like, along with, you know, executing the policy that we already have on the books, along with understanding the science and then making those decisions. How would they move forward?
So let me just start, and I'll be very brief because we may have certainly other panelists with other perspectives and different views on this. I'm kind of with General Keyes on this one. This really came up, I think, in one of the morning panels. To me, the Department of Defense should focus on the adaptation. How are we going to operate in this changed climate? Because, as I said, for all of our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetimes, the climate will be changing. It will be changing. And what does that mean? The weather changes, because you plan for climate, but you live in weather. So this means the weather that we experience, the extreme events and the not so extreme events, will change. Our job is to do what the President and the Secretary of Defense tell us to do, to basically prevent wars, but if that fails, win them. I mean, that's what we do. We can, especially on the efficiency side, be smart. We can, in places, be thought leaders. We do have an R&D budget. There are places where we can sometimes help on that. But I would focus primarily on the adaptation side. We're probably not going to be powering warships with renewables, at least in the near future. We're probably not going to be flying fighter jets and bombers with renewables, at least where I can see. There's a whole lot of other things we can do as a nation, frankly, as a world, to decarbonize. And if we're left with 1 or 2% carbon, I would be thrilled if that's what we got ourselves down to. But as I said, others, I'll stop here because others may have different views on that, but that's where I am. I would say the DoD should really be working on how do we make sure that we will prevail, frankly, in this changed climate.
Yeah, from a DoD perspective, I'd absolutely agree. The energy issue for DoD is about mission assurance and mission effectiveness. Any beneficial impact in terms of decarbonizing the DoD energy is just that. It's a benefit, but it's not the driver. But more broadly, I would say that this is obviously not an either-or issue. You need to do both. Okay, mitigation long-term will reduce the scale of the problem, but the problem is already here and it's going to get worse, and you've got to take steps to adapt to it. So I've sometimes been concerned that the intense focus on mitigation has caused people to lose sight of the intense need to do adaptation as well. And others, their concern is the other way around. That, oh, we can adapt our way out of this problem so we don't need to mitigate. Neither statement is true. You need to do both. Right now, there needs to be, I think, more increased focus, certainly in the national security community, on the adaptation side of the house. But you need to do both.
Yeah, and I would agree as a country, absolutely. But
So yeah, I agree that you have to do both. There's sort of 3 areas of defense communities' engagement with climate issues, and of course, the first is mitigation with climate, with the Department of Defense being one of the largest energy users in the world. And then secondly, obviously, adaptation to changing roles and missions and to the effects of climate change on installations. But I'd really suggest that there's a third area of engagement, and that is engaging with the strategic consequences of climate change and what it really means for allies or in areas of important security concern to the U.S. and their failure to adapt. So it's basically consequence management of failure to adapt to climate change, to me, is a third area. And I think we need a strategic infrastructure around that to really look at those issues. So that infrastructure involves, the OSD, Office of Policy, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy, places like that. Also engaging a reach back into the science agencies that are able to provide remote sensing data and those sorts of technical opportunities.
Yeah.
Let me just add to that
Go
I
ahead.
think, well, not disagreeing with any of that, I think we have to recognize that a whole of government approach here includes not just, really should be a whole of America or society. It's really not just what happens in government. A lot of the actions are going to occur in the private sector, whether it's technology developers, or public-private partnerships, or leading industries across various sectors of society, and also in communities. And just, I think, as we've seen in the last decade, that much of the initiative in climate change, in mitigation policy has not been in the federal government, which has sort of lagged the U.S. in leadership until recent years. A lot of it began to move out to state and local levels. I think when we're talking about resilience and adaptation, a lot of the innovation in our country and globally is going to happen at local levels. And we want that to occur because that's where it matters, right? We want, and so at the federal level, the idea is to sort of encourage encourage it, seed it as appropriately with the right types of investment and support it, and then get out of the way where it's working, or in critical cases where we've talked about, populations and locations that may not, forever be sustainable for human habitation, then we have to confront those issues directly. Those are going to be few and far between, but serious. But many other parts of our nation and many other parts of our planet need to have more resilient networks of a variety of types, built networks, natural networks, cyber networks, infrastructure, and the like. And we need to be consciously focused on that and make investments in it and prioritize them.
I'd just like to add that I agree with Marcus, and when I use adaptation, I use it both in the physical sense, putting up a dike, moving something to higher ground, but also in the geostrategic sense. For example, NATO to me was an adaptation to the rise of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical threat. So when I say adaptation, I mean in both senses of the word.
Yeah, to build on that, I would say, adaptation, if we got really good at adaptation, we would have had some force, some type of indications and warning of the Arab Spring. We would have understood how climate, actually weather, impacts as forced by climate in very different parts of the world, have a cascading effect that end up in North Africa and then kick off a series of consequence. Having that type of structure, and anybody who's touched that problem knows how it's hard enough to figure that out in hindsight. It's very challenging to do in foresight. So I'm not saying, well, we should have seen that. It's hard. But that would be the type of structure. And yes, I would agree under big A adaptation, that should be there as well.
Two major events and two major processes and challenges that have been referred to throughout our discussion. One example, the nuclear era. And what were the long-term strategic risks? How do we interact with the rest of the world? How do we manage within our own government? And Goldwater Nichols, which you could say that, well, it was a bookkeeping thing and it's administrative, but that's a tremendously difficult change to do within the Department of Defense. With the discussion that we've had so far today, we're talking about comparable change across the government, comparable change incorporating private industry, regional governments, state governments, international partners. What are the types of lessons that we can draw from what we've done from a nuclear security perspective over the last 6 decades, what we've done with Goldwater Nichols, where those challenges were, how we tackled some of those, and what some of those lessons might be that would be useful as once again, if the president appoints someone as a cabinet level member, what are the type of things that they need to be looking out for, and how may they learn from the past?
Well, in the nuclear age, I like to use the analogy that we invested billions and trillions of dollars of American GDP to protect against a low probability but very high consequence event of a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, which thankfully never occurred, but we spent many years, many billions of dollars of American investment and lives to deter that threat, which we did successfully. And now we are faced with, the probably higher probability and also very high consequence threats of climate change. But it's a harder challenge to mobilize resources against because it's not an immediate onset attack. There's no direct enemy. There's not just one bad actor, one bad country out there that we can point to that serves as a foil to mobilize for action. And it's one of which the science is of and evidence is of the utmost importance. So it's a different type of challenge, but more representative of the types of global challenges that we face today. So that's why I think marshaling these many forces is so much more is more difficult, but equally important. And we saw when the Paris agreements finally came together last December what effort that took, and several times of sort of failed attempts to get to agreement, but then many nations, private sector, I mean, that really was a whole of society effort, bringing together that agreement, which sets us now on a new course. But of course, that's not the end. It's really just the beginning. And now I think we're moving into this, age of consequences where we have to adapt, make societies more resilient, and generally get in front of that. And that is going to require leadership in a different way than I think we've had before. The Goldwater-Nichols, analogy, that was a bill that was about sort of clarifying roles and missions within the Department of Defense. I'm not convinced that that's actually the right analogy here. Although I think, as I go back to, I think the leadership from the top in each agencies, and leadership that brings together a whole of government, whole of society approach, and then clarifies within each agency what their missions are, I think is going to be critical.
So I'm not even sure I should bring this up 1 hour after lunch. We're all like suffering from that food shock thing. But something as we talk about this and talk about, like back in the 80s and the 70s with the nuclear threat versus the Soviets, it kind of brings up the difference between risk versus threat. I know this sounds esoteric, doesn't it? But I'm now at Penn State, so I can talk academic stuff as well. So if I remember kind of War College 101, a threat is a capability but times an intention, right? So the Soviets, we weren't sure that their intentions were totally good for us, and we knew they had a lot of capability. The French and the Brits have nukes, but we're pretty sure that we're okay with them because their intentions are good. We're pretty sure. The climate is more of a risk, and we've used both words sometimes interchangeably, but maybe it isn't, because the risk is really an impact times a probability, and the probability goes up and the impacts are going up. In fact, CNA's Military Advisory Board under Sherry's leadership put out the accelerating risks of climate change just a couple of years ago. So climate is unlike the Soviets, is not something we can deter. We can't build another 3 aircraft carriers and the ice will say, oh my God, okay, I'll stop melting now. It doesn't really care about that. We can't get it into a cost competitive cost strategy. We can't make the ice sheets build more air defenses and like bankrupt them or anything like that. So some of those things that worked with the Cold War will not apply here. And again, it's sort of that risk versus threat. I hope that makes sense. But the fundamental idea, I think Sherry was, certainly brought out there, that low probability but high consequences, that is certainly there, and that's the part that we probably need to capture.
I just wanted to make a quick reference. Thinking back, the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program really was a shining example of bipartisan consensus around an issue that was incredibly salient and continues to be. And so I think that a similar bipartisan approach is exactly what we'd recommend here on the Hill. So senators from different parties coming together to recognize an urgent threat and to provide funding to organize against it in a way that's been really successful in the case of CTR.
Yeah, and I would like to agree with that very much. I'm a nuclear baby. I was born in the New Mexico desert when my dad was working on the Manhattan Project, and I started out my military career in nuclear weapons field before the Army decided to kick me out of that and send me to law school. So I've been around nukes and my entire life, and certainly my professional life for a very long time. And what strikes me the same, and I very much agree with Dave on the difference between risk and threat, and that's often overlooked, and that can lead to some fuzzy thinking. But what strikes me as present then and missing now is that bipartisan consensus on the need to act as a nation to respond to either the risk or the threat. and to put differences aside and focus on the reality, the facts, the evidence, the strategic challenge, the strategic thinking, the investments, and the actions. So that's an aspect that I would like to see duplicated in this arena. Personally, I'm very optimistic about that. I did mention there was a lag between political action and reality, but the lag is not infinite. It does catch up, and I'm optimistic that our system is catching up.
And I think one of the things that will probably change that, here's my forecast. I'm a meteorologist. I'm really a recovering weather forecaster. So here's my forecast. What may change that is probably not heat waves so much because, well, what did you guys have here in Washington? 57 days above 90? So it's 40s or 50s or 60s. That's sort of the boiling frog issue. It's like, well, it sucks because it's hot, but everyone says, well, that's DC. But the thing that will change is when you all of a sudden have water around your feet where you didn't, and that water doesn't go away. That's kind of a state change. And I think the rising seas, whether it's storms, nuisance flooding, call it what you want, because a lot of people, as we know, live near the coast, and a lot of constituents are going to say, hey, what's going on here? Something's happening. And that might be the point where the enough of the public cares enough that we get what Bob was talking about, and I think Sherry and Marcus, this bipartisan realization that this is a very, very serious problem, and we need to address it, including its security dimensions.
Everybody's done a really good job of staying awake so far. I've been looking around. There are no closed eyes. So clearly what the panel's been talking about has held your focus and your interest. This is the time, though, for additional audience participation. So whoever would like to pose a question, please ask you to stand up. And there's some microphones out there. We'll get those around to you and get those. I would ask that the questions be focused, be brief. And really speak to the heart of the matter because I think you've got a unique opportunity to get some really insightful answers from some very experienced folks.
Hi, my name is Ian Scheffler. I'm a writer affiliated with the publisher Simon & Schuster. I looked through the report, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't see the Department of Education mentioned anywhere. So as was discussed by a panelist earlier, the generation that's growing up now is going to be the generation that's going to be dealing with this in the future. And I want to know if you had discussed it all among yourselves while you were making this set of recommendations, any kind of educational recommendation. Obviously, the military asserts a certain amount of influence on the culture of education in terms of whether it's during the space race and science, or even today, the issue with physical culture and obesity. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Let me just start with that, and I'm sure others will have something. I think it's a very interesting point there, and I think there are already not within this climate briefing, but just within the Department of Defense writ large, quite a lot of what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Yeah, I was going to say medicine. I knew it wasn't that. Math. Initiatives, because really for a strong defense, we need an educated workforce, we need a technological workforce. I mean, whether you're an officer, whether you're enlisted in any of the armed forces, the degree of technology you're working with today is pretty amazing, even compared to like when Bob and I were junior officers there. So in that sense, in a broad sense, the armed forces do require that type of education. My personal hope is that we teach the facts as they are, as the science is in climate. But I'll leave it at that.
So one of the things that was mentioned in my introduction is I'm a director of a graduate program in international affairs. So it's actually the largest graduate program in international affairs at the Elliott School. And so what we try to do is train people in an interdisciplinary way to face the most important global challenges, so disease, pandemics, nonproliferation, climate change. And with that interdisciplinary study, we really need people that are rooted in a basic science background who can then communicate with social sciences and with policy audiences about these challenges that, after all, are rooted in the physical sciences. So we're trying to build those sort of people, and also trying to educate leaders that can be informed consumers of research. They may not be able to produce the original basic bench science research, but they're able to take those types of recommendations. They're able to understand the way it's presented and then apply that into their public policy fields.
Next question. This one over here.
Hi, Samantha Brooks. I'm with Madison River Group, or Science Policy Consulting Group. This is a little more of a tactical question, I guess, about the potential implementation of these sorts of recommendations. And given how much everyone this morning and now has talked about a whole government approach, and there's even some interagency specific recommendations within here, I'm wondering if it's either within the scope of this briefing book or outside at really leveraging the existing mechanisms of interagency groups within the government, because there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of them related to climate, related to security, related to Arctic. I mean, I can name like 4 Arctic groups just within the EOP that I know about, and so making sure that when you give recommendations like this, it might be useful to actually say these are the things that you can leverage. And I don't know if that's outside of the scope of this, or if there's an intention to kind of get to that level, or if you want to leave that to the new administration, but just kind of curious as to what you all thought in the tactical level.
I'll start. And I do appreciate that. And I think if you read the briefing book in detail, you'll find a number of places where we encourage them to continue to do it or leverage existing interagency processes, et cetera. So those are certainly there. The Arctic's a prime example, but there are others. DOD and State Department have a lot of interagency things on HADR, for example, and some other things. And those are obviously need to be leveraged, but they also need to be changed. For example, the DOD State Department collaboration on security assistance matters. That's a pretty good working relationship, but it needs to be changed in this context to add this subject matter in as a new focal area. So it's not so much of saying everything that's going on is no good, so let's create everything new. Not at all. There's a lot of good stuff going on that needs to be continued and emphasized, but also some other things that need to be done.
So I'm well aware of many of those groups that you mentioned. I'm just finishing another report where I affirmed the value brought in the Arctic policy area of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, and under its current leadership, and the special representative for Arctic matters, which I think should be a permanent position within the State Department now. Any type of set of recommendations like this, and there's many others in different areas being generated now as we prepare for a new administration, have to be all taken together in context by the new team and considered as a group for what makes sense given the existing state of the organizational structure and then the priorities of the new administration.
Yeah, there's always a balance between being so general, it's like, well, is this motherhood apple pie, versus what I say, telling somebody how to suck the egg. And one is not useful, the other is not helpful. So we tried to get that balance, but as both people said before, yeah, there's a lot of ways. And then, honestly, each administration's got to figure out what works best for it. And we've seen over history, different administrations find somewhat different ways to work. Some like to have a lot of stuff in the White House, others push it out. That's not our call. That will be the incoming administration's call. And we don't want to overprescribe it, and if we did, it would probably actually lose credibility.
So I know we've got a question right here. What I would like to do, for the folks that do have pending questions, if you can all just put your hands up real quickly, just so we can assess where the microphone has to move around to, and we can take a look at it. A little bit higher, folks. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, great. And let's go ahead and this one, please.
Hi there. I'm Anwar Issa. I'm an intern with the American Security Project and a student at the Elliott School of International Affairs. So I'm kind of a city guy when it comes to this kind of stuff, and I just haven't heard much of the importance of cities in national security and in relation to climate change, rising sea levels, look at Aleppo, which is facing enormous environmental catastrophe right now. So I guess I wanted to hear some of the panelists' opinions on the future of cities in this strategy and convincing the DoD of its importance.
I thought you were going to put your professor on the spot. That would have been more fun. That would be way more fun. I mean, where do you want to start? Let's start with Miami, you know? I mean, if I could, I would figure out how to short all of South Florida because they're going under. So you look at the cities, you know, what are the big demographic trends? People are moving from the countryside, not just in the U.S., but globally, from the country to the city. And where are most of these big cities? They're on or near the coast. So when the earlier panelists talked, I think it might have been General Keyes, but you know, said business is going to be booming in like terms of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. It is this nexus of demographic trends, urbanization trends, and then the rising seas. You don't even have to put more storms or stronger storms in there. Just today's storms with rising seas will do this. Likely changes, more extremes in rainfall. So yeah, I mean, this is when we look at these as security issues, and then if this happens in a place that is already fragile, already has either issues, either just because of capacity or because of, you know, frankly, poor leadership in governance, we know what happens when chaos breaks out and people are not taken care of. Then it becomes an environment much more ripe for extremist ideologies to take hold. And then it's, you know, Katie bar the door. So yeah, the cities are a huge component and a huge area of concern, especially in states and nations that already are having a tough time with governance.
Virtually any Navy or Marine Corps briefing would start with the risks of global megacities in the littoral. And the demographics that we've, you know, the inexorable demographics, particularly in the Asia Pacific, of the migration to the cities, and then the risks of those cities becoming, you know, both sources of instability and state, and ultimately risks to the nations of which they're located in. So yes, very much. And now there's a whole new sort of fields developing on sort of urban sustainability, also city, you know, unique governance within cities, particularly in these global megacities where you have certain regions that, certain areas like the favelas and the others that are sort of almost ungoverned or uniquely governed spaces within the cities outside the traditional government structure. That has a whole set of security challenges associated with it. And so, yes, it's a good point.
You know, we had where are the microphones at now? There we go.
Hi, good afternoon. Commander Deborah Loomis, Navy JAG. I'm an environmental attorney at Navy headquarters as well. And I've been to a number of forums like this. I've participated in the Intergovernmental Pilot Project down in Hampton Roads for 2 years. And I think what frustrates me when I walk away is we spend a lot of time talking about the problem, its various manifestations, permutations, but not enough time talking about the solutions, and not just kind of institutional and creating offices. But I was heartened to hear Ms. Goodman really talk about the emphasis on innovation and technology, like resilience technology. And I think that needs to make more of its way into more of these recommendations. And sort of related to that, maybe off topic, but we talked about adaptation and mitigation quite a bit. We never really talk about sequestration, and I don't know if, and I'm not talking about like sucking things out of the air and storing it underground, but in soils and in oceans and kind of major planetary systems that have been off kilter.